Welcome back to Sane-ish. I'm Jo Carducci, and today we're diving deep with Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman and one particularly loud cicada. But Alexander Vindman is a man who literally put country over politics by testifying during the first Trump impeachment and standing tall when most were ducking. Beyond his heroic moment in history, Alex brings frontline experience watching Russia's aggression up close and the chilling reality of how political calculations can shape foreign policy. Recently, Alex wrote about what he calls Trump's Ukraine pivot in his Substack called Why It Matters. And I highly recommend reading that piece and subscribing over there as well. Because if you want to understand what real patriotism looks like in an era of spin and how the resilience of democracy depends on telling hard truths, pour a drink, settle in, and get ready for a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Welcome to Sane-ish, Alex. Thanks for being here. I actually want to jump right in because I want to talk about your Substack piece on Trump's Ukraine pivot, but I really need, I'm going to squeeze this information out of as many brilliant people as I possibly can because I really need to understand what the literal fuck Tulsi Gabbard is doing right now and how they're trying. Let's start there. Can you kind of give us the cliff notes on both what she's doing and the implications of what she's trying to do?
Fundamentally, she's trying to get back into Trump's good graces. It's not just critical for her to be loyal, but it's important for her to carry the president's water. Her being at odds with Trump's narrative for the Iran strikes put her on the outs. She was outside of the meetings, outside of the decision. So now she's trying to demonstrate that she is, doing what she was hired to do, which is to politicize the office of the director of national intelligence. And, in certain regards, probably the most forgiving answer is color intelligence, more than likely actually fabricate intelligence or make statements absent any intelligence just as a political actor. And what she's trying to do is basically paint the narrative that the former President Obama, and Hillary Clinton, the candidate and former Secretary of State, attempted to steal the 2016 election, which, by the way, he won, which is strange.
Yeah.
So that, I guess, I'm not sure what his complaints are. Should we ever rerun that one? Should we cancel
I'm
and
happy
all
to do
the
that.
first?
Yeah, let's do it again.
Yeah. Although we don't want to give him another term. And then then he also has complaints about the 2020 election when he had all the levers of power. He had the ability to expose or, counter any corruption, and he didn't do that because he was defeated. So he's trying to change the story away from the Epstein files that is really damaging to him with his base.
Yeah. And the core of this, I agree with you. I think that this is distraction palooza and it's whack-a-mole, and they just keep trying to move the chains because they think that they'll have one magic, bullet that will take the base and others off of this Epstein thing, but it's not going anywhere. And now the House, bipartisan actually, has voted in one of their subcommittees to subpoena these files and the Clintons, et cetera. But the central premise of what MAGA is now trying to combat this Epstein stuff with is that Russia did not, in fact, attempt to meddle or interfere in the 2016 election. And all of that was manufactured by Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, James Comey, James Clapper, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that her proof shows that they lied to the American people.
Yeah.
Again, that would go against other DNIs, but also a lot of Republicans, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who released an intelligence report confirming that this happened. But MAGA, they only care about the top line. And what they're now saying is that all of that was a lie, and they knew it was a Russia hoax.
Yeah. So to keep it simple, it's this. Russia has been interfering successfully. It's not a question of whether they drove the outcomes. They've actually been interfering in elections for the better part of a decade. I would say since probably 2000 consistently. I mean, in my book, I talk about the 2004 Ukrainian election, the Orange Revolution. And that was Russia's effort to interfere in elections in its own backyard. They used the same templates repeatedly in Eastern Europe and to drive far-right parties. So the 2016 election should be understood as a Russian effort to interfere. but really playing and nibbling on the margins. The Trump administration encouraging the Russians to interfere, the Russians attempting to interfere, and having some kind of minimal effects that didn't really drive an outcome. To be
Right.
fair, Trump won that election.
Yeah.
And I guess, he doesn't want to take that win. But he then circles back around to 2020, which he lost pretty decisively, and is claiming that that election was stolen. But all of this is to distract from these Epstein files. And the MAGA base is really fired up about this because they've been led to believe that, the Democrats were the pedophiles, groomers, and so forth. And they want to know who's on this list. And it turns out that almost certainly Trump is repeatedly on this list. If we remember his reputation as a New York playboy, dirty old man, even when he was, in his youth in the 80s and 70s.
Yeah, he called it avoiding an STD his personal Vietnam, the guy who dodged the draft 5 times and invented bone spurs to do so. But yeah, I mean, that, and of course, the Wall Street Journal reporting is that, according to them, Pam Bondi briefed him on the fact that his name is in the files multiple times back in May, which he was asked about like on the 15th of this month and said, no, she didn't. But whatever. That can't confirm that yet. But I want to stay on the Russia front, so to speak, because you have a Substack. Your Substack is called Why It Matters, and that's incredible. It's a great name because, that's the core of how I became familiar with you, and you became the reason I named my LLC Right Matters. But you have a Substack titled Trump's Ukraine Pivot, a painful, predictable lesson learned over 6 months. The last time you and I talked, we talked about your book, The Folly of Realism, how the West deceived itself about Russia and betrayed Ukraine. The last time we talked, you were saying he needs to get up to speed much faster on all of this. And he seemingly has made a pivot in the fact that he's starting to at least audibly say that Putin isn't cooperating. And of course he's not. But he also agreed to sell Patriot missiles, et cetera, to NATO, who can then give them to Ukraine. So can you kind of unpack in a user-friendly way what his pivot entails, where it came from, and there's a 50-day window, et cetera. What kind of impact will it actually have?
So I wrote an article back in, I guess, January or so of this year, kind of forecasting what Trump might do with regards to his Russia-Ukraine policy. One of the most dangerous course of action, which was the fact that he might just cut off Ukraine entirely. That was, we managed to avoid that worst case scenario. There was a, late February, but over this Oval Office meeting back in late February, but the relationship was reestablished and the intelligence sharing continued to flow. What ended up happening is what I forecast actually was that Trump, the biggest impediment to Trump's desires for an end to this war would not be the Ukrainians that are willing to bend over backwards and compromise. It would be the fact that Putin repeatedly saying that he is, he wants an end to this war would prove himself to be the obstacle to peace. And, I'm not sure how much Trump really cares about ending this war in its own right. The humanitarian disaster doesn't ring true as a reason for him to want to end the war. For him, it's about something as simple as, playing the hero. That he was able to drive this outcome, and that this advances his desires and his belief that he needs to get a peace prize like Barack Obama did or something of that nature. So from his standpoint, coming around to this lesson that Putin was blocking his desires to claim an end to this war was going to get us there eventually. What ended up happening over the course of 6 months is he put a significant pressure on Ukraine. He put pressure or kicked the ball into the Europeans' court to play a leading role, and at the same time was very, very accommodating to Putin and his interests, and that was a recipe for disaster. Just again, because I wrote a book on this. This was the general premise that accommodating Russia, catering to misplaced hopes that Russia would deliver on this, policy objective of ending a war, when for Russia this is quite critical that they come out with looking like the victor, in order to maintain their kind of geopolitical stature. Also important to their ability to build Russian power. For them, it's about dominating the Ukrainian population. It's this industrial base component. It's the project of empire building. So it's not easy for them to give up on this idea. I mean, they could be convinced to do that through our defeats on the battlefield, but it's going to take more than just, our Trump's pleas for peace and accommodation.
And what is this 50-day window both going to accomplish? And what is it all about? Like, is it about Trump, like, still holding out hope that his buddy, his daddy Vladdy, is going to be like, oh yeah, I've changed my mind, I've had an epiphany after 50 days? And is Trump actually, is Taco going to come through? Because Putin hasn't stopped, right? Like, nothing, he hasn't actually like let up at all, right?
Whether he comes through or not, there's a couple of developments that are in their own right pretty critical. The first one, which was a question I had even as I wrote the piece, I kind of concluded that ultimately it's one thing to gift. Well, this is the way that Trump kind of described our aid to Ukraine, that it was, somehow a gift instead of, it was the fact that it was in our U.S. national security interest to support Ukraine. But it's a different story to sell, and to be able to do that kind of transaction is clearly in his interest, as the deal maker. And I thought that we would end up in a place where he'd be willing to sell to the Ukrainians or to the Europeans to give to the Ukrainians. But it was a question that, like, how deep was his animus to Ukraine? How much was he willing to accommodate Russia? And it turns out that, you know, going back to the basics, that he saw a deal here he could claim some sort of success in, and that's what he did. So I'd say at minimum, Ukraine now has access to military industrial resources from the US, quite critical to supporting their war effort. And then the question is, after the 50 days, what does he do? Does he ratchet up the pressure? Does he levy sanctions? And there's a bipartisan effort in Congress to levy a much more severe sanctions. Frankly, following the Europeans have done a couple of different things to ratchet up sanctions on Russia, including this one of Russia's biggest revenue generators is the sale of oil, and they capped the price at $45 a barrel for oil. And does the U.S. kind of fall in line? And we increase pressure? Do we provide more aid? And so that's the question at 50 days.
Yeah. And I've had this conversation with a couple of people. I'm sure you're aware of Tom Malinowski. I had this conversation with him. I had this conversation with my friend Joel Rubin about how what are your impressions of NATO Secretary General Rutte? And like what I perceive, and I'm a layman for sure, but what I perceive is that the world has gotten smarter. I mean, Zelensky's great at manipulating Donald Trump by using what you just said. They give him the perception and the appearance of looking like this, art of the deal maker, and
Yep.
whatever that looks like. And you can manipulate him into doing what you want him to do.
It's true. It's a pretty fine line. What you don't want to do is you don't want to embolden and kind of promote bad behavior and pander to him.
Right.
And, calling him daddy or something like that is probably a little bit too far.
Right.
But in general, figuring out a way to navigate the next 3.5 years and, keeping the president happy and on side so he doesn't blow stuff up. I mean, at this point, again, another big concern, and John Bolton talked about this, and I've had concerns about the fact that in a second administration, we would end up in a situation where he might choose to withdraw from NATO, and Rutte has been successful about keeping him engaged. And I think more to the point, the president seems to buy into this idea of 5% spending on GDP, and is likely now kind of more of a proponent for NATO. So I think that's good. Zelensky's also proven himself to be pretty adept. He's charismatic. I saw that in my interactions with him, and the idea that he could talk to the president in a way that, at least behind the scenes, probably appeals to his ego. He can't do that so much publicly and look weak because he's got a war to fight, but he's been pretty skilled at engaging the president. And I think all in all, that's probably the way you navigate it. I think the Russians and our adversaries may try to do the same thing, but there is a big gap between what they say and what they do. And at least with the allies, that gap is much, much smaller. They might not deliver on everything, but they deliver on the things that keep the president engaged and happy.
And Trump, it's funny because I was worried about NATO for sure, because he said things to that effect when he was campaigning for the second season of the shit show. But he has reversed course a lot. And he said actually that we need NATO and we need to be a part of NATO. And it's interesting because with Zelensky, I mean, we saw that Oval Office disaster, right? But then we see them at the Vatican, and Zelensky's got a one-on-one audience, and they're just sitting in a couple of chairs. And Trump's tune started to change after that too. And I mean, it's so interesting to see this arc, this journey between these two. When the original sin is the perfect phone call, which is where you enter the scene, and to see now Zelensky is a war president, a wartime president, and an incredibly adept negotiator. They even got that, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but the deal with the minerals and all of that shit, they even worked that deal out so that it was more beneficial to Ukraine than the original drafting of it. So it's so interesting to watch this evolution.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are folks that have kind of figured out how to potentially work with Trump. And I think that's, what the next 3.5 years are going to look like for our allies. Our adversaries are going to see how much they could, how much they could take from Trump. In a lot of ways, the stronger countries, the big players, the Chinas, the Russias of the world, have a huge amount of latitude because a lot of what Trump says is bluster. He could lean on the smaller states and the medium states and has leverage. We're a massive economic powerhouse, but these other larger states, I mean, they don't have to play ball, and I think they're going to, talk to them, see what they can get. You did mention, Zelensky's skill. I want to mention for this group here that Zelensky kind of stepped in it this week. There
Oh,
was
yeah?
kind of, it was a pretty significant own goal. One of the biggest concerns with Ukraine has always been corruption and Ukraine's fight to root out corruption. And part of the journey of getting Ukraine to address corruption was these independent anti-corruption bureaus. And they'd been operating for a while, and there's some clear indications that they were starting to look carefully at some corruption from inside the Zelensky's presidential administration. And he rammed through a law this week that was going to eliminate the independence of these anti-corruption courts. And for the folks that have been paying attention and working on Ukraine for a long time, this is a significant warning sign. There's always been a bit of a kind of just the way Trump also operates as a CEO, an authoritarian streak that he calls the shots. Everybody else has to bend to his will. And he's managed to kind of take the council and check that at times, but he overreached this time, and it's creating quite a bit a backlash, including some protests on the streets. Is this meaningful in the fact that it's going to destabilize Ukraine or undo all the progress? No, but the fact that there's a protest and Ukraine's allies are speaking out against this, and that fact that he's likely going to have to reverse course or make some adjustments is a good sign, because he's been in power for a long time, 6 years. And at some point you start to think that, you're untouchable, that what you say goes, and that's never a good sign in democracy. You want those checks and balances. So hopefully he corrects that, and let's that fight to root out corruption in Ukraine kind of continue to unfold wherever it leads.
It's interesting. Somebody you and I are both very close to shared an article with me ahead of our interview from Politico about this very thing, and I'm looking at it now, and it is interesting because they say the extent of this democratic backsliding became clearer this week after President Vladimir Zelensky gutted the two anti-corruption agencies. Those very words, this democratic backsliding, when you juxtapose that against what we are hoping Ukraine will be against Russian aggression and what that will mean for democracy abroad, it is fascinating that here we are, but the whole world is moving in this
Yeah,
democratic backsliding direction. But for Ukraine to do that in the midst of all of this, I mean, it's terrifying, but it's also, I think it's not getting enough attention. And how does that play into Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin's narratives?
yeah. So I mean, it plays into both their narratives. The right wing MAGA that Ukraine's corrupt, Putin's narrative that Ukraine's corrupt. Trump could probably fundamentally care less about it because
Yeah,
he's engaged in his his own unprecedented corruption, and this is reversible for sure. I think that there needs to be we the community of supporters needs to call out this mistake and allow Zelensky to make a correction, and allow Ukraine to move forward. With this is a key precursor to Ukraine's accession to the EU, access to international financial resources, and what we can have is Ukraine, win the war, so-called exit the war as a sovereign independent state, but lose the peace as with regards to democratic backsliding. But I think the fact is that Ukraine being the focal point of so much attention, geopolitical attention, means that it doesn't get swept under the rug, or it's not below that interest level. It's going to continue to draw attention, and therefore I think there's going to likely be a correction.
that's good. I mean, it is fascinating, and you're right. I mean, the whole world is watching, and the NATO allies have a lot at stake here in the immediate term, and so to watch that happen there would be completely counterintuitive. Let me ask you, just in closing, what is the state of Russian aggression in Ukraine? What is the state of Ukraine's sovereignty, and what is the end game here, and exit strategy for all of them?
Yeah, I don't see any risks on the horizon with regards to Ukraine's sovereignty. The fact is, it's assured at this point, and it was probably locked in the early parts of this war. And Ukraine's done a lot to build its own defensive capabilities to even weather U.S. absence or withdrawal. Uh, Things get harder, but Ukraine doesn't risk going away as a sovereign independent state. And what they do need is they need European supporters and U.S. Support in order to deliver some decisive victories and maybe help wind down the war. So because that's not happening, this war will continue to kind of roll forward. What I think we should keep in mind is that yes, Ukraine is learning and it's building its own industrial base. They provide about 60% of the resources they need for this war effort. Europeans are pitching in, but the Russians are also innovating and developing. I'd say much of their legacy force, the way that their troops conduct themselves, the production of, let's say, armored vehicles and things of that nature, they still haven't really managed to get their act together. They're successful because they have mass. They're a larger country, but there are pockets of success and excellence. Just like the Ukrainians have built a um, industry around drones, the Russians are doing the same thing. I'm frankly pretty struck by how quickly the Russians could push out these Iranian drones that they've rebranded under and are domestically manufacturing in Ukraine, and the volumes of these drones that they could fire off at Ukraine, hundreds and hundreds on any given day, repeatedly, day after day. And then they've managed to juice their production of missiles to a certain extent also. But what they can't do is they can't build enough armored vehicles. They can't seem to train their troops to make any meaningful headway. What they do is just throw loads and loads of folks at the Ukrainian front lines, and when the Ukrainians falter because they don't have the people there to the Russians take relatively tiny tracts of land at extremely high cost. So that's not a recipe for success, at least not in any like meaningful time horizon. We're talking about years before that they could stack something like that into something really, really meaningful. But it is a prescription for lots of bloodshed, lots of misery, and maybe with the Trump administration making this pivot, selling to Ukraine, exchanging this is one of the interesting aspects of this kind of this deal that Trump's worked out in exchange for Ukrainian drone technology, which they're the front runners on. That we're going to provide them military resources. That's another good aspect to this deal that the Ukrainians worked out. Maybe with all this together and whatever 40 days from now, when Trump's time clock expires, maybe there is a ratcheting up of sanctions and some additional aid coming through that helps the Ukrainians kind of position for a year from now something relatively decisive on the battlefield. And that's what ultimately convinces Putin to wind down this war, to negotiate in good faith.
Yeah, because I mean, if the 40 days left in this window expires and that Senate bill gives him the latitude, because Lindsey Graham was sure to make sure that he did enough fluffing to give him the latitude to impose secondary sanctions that could go from 0 to like whatever 400% or whatever,
Yeah.
then that's when shit gets real, because then we're talking geopolitical implications for India and China, et cetera, which of course Taco is probably going to back out of, but we'll see, right? So I guess here we go again, kicking the can down the road. But I'm glad to know, at least, for something as a novice observer, I was worried about Ukraine in the early days of this not lasting a week or a month, because it seemed to somebody looking from my perspective that they couldn't. So it is heartening to see that they are still standing, and that there's longevity here, and that their sovereignty is not on the chopping block as I once feared. So that's an incredibly important perspective to have. And thank you for giving it to me. Again, friends, the Substack is why it matters. Alexander Vindman, the most recent book, The Folly of Realism, How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine, all invaluable insight. And thank you so much once again for explaining all of this in a way that people can understand, because I think there's so many moving parts, particularly as it pertains to all of this foreign affairs, foreign policy stuff, that it's crucially important that Americans understand it. And you have such a way of explaining it so adeptly and succinctly and in a user-friendly way that makes a big difference to people like me. So thank you.
It's always a pleasure. Yep. Thanks for having me on. And I look forward to the next time. There's so much, I mean, foreign policy is my comfort zone, but there's so much going on with regards to national security at home, with regards to, these efforts to steal the 2026 election, infringement on rights. I mean, it's a busy plate. I'm glad that you're talking about it.
Yeah, it's a very busy plate, and I mean, we didn't even touch on the State Department cuts and the impacts on our national security via the abdication of our soft power and et cetera, et cetera. We can have that conversation. I want to continue this conversation, because I always say to like my friends in this space, when I was a college kid, my dad would be driving me to Boston, go to school. He worked in the Department of Defense, and this was his comfort zone and his lane, and I didn't understand anything. And so I would spend 4.5 hours picking my dad's brain, largely on the Middle East because he's Lebanese. But I would ask all the questions, because he understood mostly what he was talking about and I didn't. And I knew that these things were important. But I think that these conversations are massively important, and people don't engage with them because they feel intimidated or they feel like they don't know what they're talking about. But that's okay, because there are a lot of people out there like you who do. So that's why I'm so grateful for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe.
I want to thank Lieutenant Colonel Vindman for joining me today. Check out Alex's work and subscribe to his newsletter on Substack called Why It Matters, and follow him at avindman.com. And to all of you, thank you for being here with me through these "are you fucking kidding me" moments. Let's connect over on Substack, and if you have a second, please rate and review the Sane-ish podcast. Until next time, stay strong, stay sane-ish, and never forget that patriotism demands more than loyalty to party. It demands loyalty to the facts.